Mark, Laura, Emma, and Ryan Bennett were the picture of an ordinary suburban family. But when lockdown sealed their street in silence, their home turned into a chamber of death. What seemed like isolation for safety became the stage for one of the most horrifying tragedies their town had ever known. The neighborhood of Willow Creek Lane had always been the kind of place where little ever changed. Rows of modest houses lined the quiet street, their lawns neatly trimmed, their mailboxes painted in matching shades of white and grey. Children used to ride their bicycles along the pavement, dogs barked at passing cars, and neighbors exchanged casual greetings as they watered their gardens or collected the morning paper. But in the spring of 2020, everything grew still. The lockdown pressed down on life like a heavy blanket, muffling every sound, cutting off every familiar rhythm. With people ordered to stay indoors, the street that once held the heartbeat of a small community became eerily silent, almost lifeless. Like a movie scene paused in the middle of action. Among the neat houses, there stood one that people rarely spoke about. It was old, its brick walls slightly weathered, its curtains almost always drawn. The Bennett home had never attracted much attention. It wasn't falling apart, nor was it remarkable in beauty. It was simply there, at the very end of the street, tucked slightly away from view by tall hedges. To most, it was invisible, a house people passed without noticing. But as the weeks of lockdown stretched on, it began to stand out, not because of its charm, but because of the unsettling details that slowly began to surface. At first, no one thought much about it. The world was consumed by fear and confusion, and everyone was focused on their own survival. But neighbors began to notice small, odd things about the house. The curtains never shifted, day or night. Delivery packages started to pile up on the front porch, rain-soaked and forgotten. The mailbox overflowed with letters, some of them slipping onto the walkway. It was strange, but easy to explain away. After all, people had left town suddenly when the lockdown first started. Some families had moved in with relatives, others had gone to vacation homes, hoping to ride out the chaos in comfort. It wasn't unreasonable to think the Bennetts had done the same. Still, the longer the house remained unchanged, the harder it became to ignore. A few neighbors, those who liked to watch the street from their windows, swore they hadn't seen the family. 4 weeks. No one walked the dog, no one took out the trash, no one waved from the porch. The silence of the street magnified the absence, making the house appear darker, heavier, as though it carried secrets within its walls. And then came the smell that it started as something faint, almost unnoticeable, like spoiled food left too long in a kitchen. But with each passing day, it grew stronger, sour, and suffocating. The warm spring air carried it across the street, drifting into open windows, clinging to the nostrils of anyone passing by. Whispers began to spread, cautious at first but quickly gaining force. Something was wrong inside the house. Some neighbors tried to push away the thought. The world was already grim enough. But others couldn't shake the unease. One woman crossing the street late at night swore she saw a shadow move behind the curtains, though the house had been dark for weeks. Another neighbor claimed to hear faint noises, something metallic dragging, followed by a dull thud. Each story fueled the next, and the house began to take on an almost sinister presence in the minds of those who lived nearby. Despite the growing suspicion, no one dared to act. The rules of lockdown, combined with fear of the unknown, kept people away. What if the family was simply quarantining inside? What if they were ill and needed privacy? No one wanted to intrude, yet no one could fully turn away from the growing dread. Each day, the mystery thickened, and the ordinary house at the end of Willow Creek Lane transformed into a symbol of quiet terror. By the time authorities were finally called, the Bennett home had already gained a reputation. It was no longer invisible. It was the place everyone noticed, the place no one wanted to approach, and the place where a grim discovery would soon shatter the fragile calm of a lockdown world. The Bennetts were not a family that drew much attention before the world shut down. Mark Bennett had worked long hours as a shift supervisor at a local factory. Neighbors remembered him as quiet but polite, often nodding a greeting when he returned home late in the evening. His wife, Laura, was seen more often, a woman who carried herself with a sense of calm responsibility. She was usually accompanied by her 2 children, Emma and Ryan, both teenagers who had been regular sights on the school bus and at the corner store. They were not particularly close to anyone on the street, yet they fit neatly into the rhythm of suburban life. To most people, they were simply another family, living an ordinary existence in an ordinary house. When lockdown arrived, the routine of everyone's lives was disrupted. The Bennetts, like others, were expected to remain indoors, leaving only for essentials. At first, nothing seemed unusual about their absence. Days passed into weeks, and people were more focused on stocking up groceries and following daily news reports than watching what their neighbors were doing. But as time went on, the silence surrounding the Bennett home began to feel unnatural. Delivery drivers were the first to raise subtle alarms. Groceries were dropped off on the porch, bags left sitting for days until they spoiled in the sun. Packages went uncollected, stacked haphazardly by the door, some collapsing into the shrubs. It was as if the family was inside but unwilling, or unable, to step out even for a moment. Concern deepened when the local school reported Emma and Ryan absent from all online classes. Attempts to reach the family through email went unanswered. Automated calls were ignored. Friends of the children, who had once exchanged messages regularly, confessed they hadn't heard from either of them since the beginning of lockdown. Their phones rang but never connected. Neighbors speculated nervously. Some thought the Bennetts might have traveled suddenly to escape the rising anxiety in the city. Others believed they were simply struggling privately, coping with the stress in their own way. Yet small details didn't add up. The trash bin stayed at the curb, untouched and overflowing. Curtains remained drawn day after day, even when the weather turned warm and bright. And then there was the smell that seemed to drift faintly from the side of the house, a scent people tried to dismiss as perhaps a dead animal or spoiled food. Despite the troubling signs, no one made immediate moves to intervene. In those months, fear ruled people's decisions. The idea of entering someone else's home carried its own dangers, and suspicions of sickness kept neighbors at a distance. But unease deepened after one late evening incident. A delivery driver, frustrated at leaving yet another package, reported hearing noises from inside the house. He described them as faint but distinct, the scraping of something heavy across the floor, followed by dull, irregular thuds. No one could confirm his story, but once it spread across the neighborhood, it only fueled the growing sense that something was very wrong. The turning point came when utility workers reported unusual readings from the property. Electricity usage had dropped sharply, almost as if the home was abandoned, yet the lights occasionally flickered on at odd hours. That contradiction, combined with weeks of silence, was enough for neighbors to finally call authorities. The police were asked to perform a welfare check. Officers arrived one warm afternoon, standing in front of the Bennett home as the street watched silently from behind curtains and blinds. The front door was locked, the windows sealed tightly from within. Knocks went unanswered. When no sound came from inside, officers made the decision to force their way in. The moment they stepped across the threshold, the stench that had unsettled the street became overpowering. What had been whispered fears now solidified into something far more concrete. The house that had been ignored for so long was no longer just a curiosity. It was about to become the center of a tragedy that would haunt the community for years. The officers who entered the Bennett home were not prepared for what they encountered. The air inside was thick, heavy, and suffocating, carrying a foul odor that made their eyes water and their stomachs turn. It was clear the house had been sealed. 4 weeks. Every window was shut tight, curtains drawn, and the silence within was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps against the creaking floorboards. What should have been a family home felt more like an abandoned shell, frozen in time. The first rooms they searched gave off the impression of a sudden stop in daily life. In the living room, the furniture was overturned, as if something violent had taken place. A lamp lay shattered on the carpet, its broken glass half hidden under a sofa cushion. Children's shoes sat in the corner, lined up neatly as though someone had carefully placed them there. The television remote rested on the floor beside a blanket, but the television itself had been unplugged. It was as if the house held evidence of a normal evening interrupted by chaos. The kitchen told an even darker story. Plates of food remained on the table, long spoiled, covered in mold and crawling with insects. Cups were still half-filled, untouched for weeks. The refrigerator hummed faintly but was nearly empty, save for cartons of milk that had curdled and containers of leftovers that had grown unrecognizable. Trash overflowed from the bin, yet no one had bothered to take it outside. To the officers, it was as if the family had stopped living their lives. All at once, every routine task abandoned in the same moment. The upstairs was no less unsettling. The children's bedrooms remained almost untouched, school books left open on desks, computers frozen on login screens. Beds were unmade, clothes scattered on the floor, and in one room a calendar had stopped mid-March, with nothing written after. That date. What disturbed investigators most was the absence of the family themselves. Every room carried traces of their existence, yet nowhere were they to be found. It was the basement that ended the search. The door leading down was locked from the outside, secured with a rusted bolt. Forcing it open, officers were met with darkness and the overwhelming stench that had been seeping through the neighborhood. Flashlights cut through the pitch black, revealing a concrete floor, cold and damp. There, laid out carefully in a row, were 4 bodies. They were covered with bedsheets, as if someone had tried to hide them but also arranged them with deliberate care. The sheets were pulled back one by one, and the truth became unavoidable. Mark Bennett, his wife Laura, and their children Emma and Ryan were all there. Their bodies showed signs of having been lifeless for weeks. The sight was horrific, not only because of the decay, but because of the orderliness. Someone had taken the time to arrange them side by side, heads aligned, hands folded across their chests. It was not a scene of panic, but of grim ritual. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. The front door had been locked from the inside, the windows sealed shut, and the alarm system still armed. Nothing suggested that an outsider had come in to harm the family. The conclusion, terrifying in its implications, was that whatever happened inside had been carried out by someone who lived their word spread of the discovery. Willow Creek Lane filled with flashing lights and hushed whispers. Neighbors stood at a distance, horrified, trying to process how a family they had passed every day could have met such an end. The Bennett home, once invisible, had become the darkest place in the community. And while the bodies had been found, the truth of what had happened inside remained hidden, waiting for investigators to uncover the twisted story that led to the basement of death. Investigators combed through every inch of the Bennett home, determined to piece together the chain of events that had led to the discovery in the basement. What at first looked like a senseless tragedy began to reveal a far darker narrative. The autopsies provided the first real breakthrough. Laura and the 2 children had not died from natural causes. Traces of poison were found in their systems. It was a slow-acting substance, mixed into their meals over a period of days. The evidence suggested that their deaths were deliberate, carefully planned rather than impulsive. The realization sent a chill through the investigative team. The question shifted from what had killed them to who among them had carried out such a plan. Attention quickly turned to Mark Bennett. His body was found alongside his family, but there were key differences in the way he died. While the others showed clear signs of poisoning, Mark's cause of death was determined to be self-inflicted. He had taken a fatal dose of the same substance, though later, after the rest of his family had already succumbed. The arrangement of the bodies in the basement also pointed to him. The care with which they were laid side by side suggested not only knowledge of their deaths but also a deliberate effort to control how they would be found. For investigators, the conclusion was unavoidable. Mark had killed his wife and children before turning the poison on himself. But the bigger mystery was why. Those who knew the Bennetts described Mark as a hard-working father and a steady presence in his family's life. There were no police reports, no public signs of abuse, No neighbors who recalled violent arguments or concerning behavior. The crime seemed to clash violently with the image of the man they thought they knew. Searching for answers, investigators turned to what was left behind in the house. Laura's diaries became one of the most important pieces of evidence. In the months before her death, she had written about changes in her husband. He had grown distant, spending hours locked away in the spare room, barely speaking to the rest of the family. She described his paranoia, his obsession with the news of the spreading pandemic, and his growing belief that the world outside was collapsing. In one chilling entry, she wrote that he had begun to talk about unseen forces, about the house being a place of refuge against what he called the sickness of the soul. Though Laura's writing stopped abruptly weeks before the deaths, her words painted a picture of a man unraveling. Even more disturbing were the papers found in Mark's desk. He had filled notebooks with erratic thoughts, blending fears of infection with apocalyptic warnings. Pages spoke of evil moving from within and the idea that his family had been touched by it. One entry declared, "Better to save them before they are lost completely." Investigators read those words as a distorted justification for murder. It became clear that Mark had convinced himself that killing his wife and children was an act of salvation, not cruelty. His final act of suicide seemed to be the conclusion of that twisted logic. The community struggled to reconcile this truth. How could a man who appeared ordinary, even kind, carry out something so calculated and cruel? For investigators, the Bennett case became more than a story of family tragedy. It was an illustration of how isolation and fear could fester in dangerous ways. Mark's descent had gone unnoticed, hidden behind the closed curtains of lockdown. Without contact from friends, colleagues, or extended family, no one had seen just how far his mind had unraveled until it was too late. The dark truth was undeniable. What had first appeared to be a mystery of external violence was instead the product of horror from within. The Bennetts had not been victims of a stranger, nor of a break-in gone wrong. They had been destroyed by the very man who should have protected them. The case file closed with a conclusion that left more grief than resolution, for lives ended not by the dangers outside their home, but by the darkness that had grown within it. News of the case spread quickly beyond the neighborhood. Newspapers and television stations seized on the details, describing the house as a tomb during lockdown and a place of silence and death. Reporters pieced together the story, emphasizing Mark Bennett's descent into paranoia and the disturbing way he had taken the lives of those closest to him. For the public, it became one of the most haunting reminders of how isolation could distort the human mind. What shocked people most was not the idea of violence itself, but the fact that it had unfolded quietly in a family that appeared so ordinary. The house remained empty in the months that followed. Realtors listed it, but no buyers came forward. Those who toured the property often left quickly, unsettled by the atmosphere within. The smell of decay had long since faded, yet the memory of what had happened there seemed to cling to the walls. Rumors grew, fueled by the unease of the community. Some said lights flickered on at night even though the electricity had been shut off. Others claimed they heard footsteps or faint voices coming from inside, though the house stood locked and empty. Whether truth or imagination, these stories added another layer of fear to an already cursed place. For the neighborhood, the Bennett family's fate was a constant reminder of the thin line between normalcy and horror. In many ways, it shattered the illusion of safety. If such darkness could grow inside a home that looked no different from any other, then where else might it be hiding? Parents grew more protective of their children, watching closely for signs of fear or isolation. Conversations that once revolved around school events or weekend plans shifted toward mental health, paranoia, and the hidden struggles people might face behind closed doors. Investigators eventually closed the case, marking it as a murder-suicide, but the sense of unease remained unresolved. There was no courtroom trial, no opportunity for the community to hear answers from the person responsible. Mark Bennett's reasoning was forever trapped in the fragmented notebooks he left behind, and the voices of Laura, Emma, and Ryan were silenced forever. For the survivors who lived nearby, the lack of justice made the tragedy feel incomplete, as though the truth had been only half uncovered, Over time, the Bennett home fell into disrepair. The lawn grew wild, weeds breaking through, cracks in the driveway. Windows gathered dust, shutters hung crooked, and the porch sagged with neglect. It became a place avoided by everyone, the kind of property that turned up in ghost stories told by teenagers daring each other to step onto the porch at night. To older residents, however, the fear was rooted not in superstition but in memory. They had seen the flashing lights, smelled the stench, and felt the horror of learning what lay beneath the basement sheets. Even years later, the story of the Bennett family was told and retold, evolving into a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the fragility of the human mind. People spoke of it not just as a crime but as a warning that darkness does not always come from outside threats. Sometimes it grows quietly, in the very places meant to offer safety and comfort. The house of death in lockdown, as it came to be called, remained a chilling reminder that even in times when the world slows to silence, unimaginable horrors can unfold just a few feet away, hidden behind closed curtains and locked doors.